Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and we have an exciting show in store for you today. I want to talk about two things today. First, I want to talk about Ford v Ferrari. I've been watching a lot of Formula One recently out of a random resurgence of that in my life. And my friends wanted to watch a movie about motorsports. So naturally, as chief recommender, I suggested we watch Ford versus Ferrari, and they loved it. I guess I think they liked it. Anyway, yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about Ford versus Ferrari, and then I want to talk about what the next few episodes of the podcast are going to look like. Starting from today, I'm going to do a series about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, analyzing every film, giving my takes, good and bad. But today I want to talk a little bit about why I love the Marvel Cinematic Universe so much, but also the limitations that it brings and how it's not the perfect form of storytelling, despite it being the defining cinematic paradigm of our generation. But anyway, let's get into it. Let's talk about Ford versus Ferrari. Returning to a regularly scheduled segment, we're talking about my hot take, and that is that Ford versus Ferrari it's basically the anti-corporation movie a corporation would make. And we'll get into that, but first I want to talk about Ford versus Ferrari as a movie on its own. Now, the movie follows American automotive designer Carroll Shelby and British race car driver Ken Miles as they battle corporate interference, the laws of physics, and their own personal demons to build a revolutionary vehicle for the Ford Motor Company. Together, they plan to compete against the race cars of Enzo Ferrari at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in France in 1966. Now, this is a motorsport film. It's an underdog film. It's got two of the biggest names in Hollywood. It's written by Jez and John Henry Butterworth, who were fresh off of Edge of Tomorrow, as well as Jason Keller from, he did Escape Plan. It's directed by James Mangold. Now, James Mangold has done Night and Day before this, but also Logan. Logan was definitely the better of the two. And, as I said, starring two of the biggest names in Hollywood, Matt Damon and Christian Bale, who play Carroll Shelby and Ken Miles, respectively. Now, Ford vs. Ferrari, in a very streamlined and exhilarating fashion, talks about the tale of Detroit grit and dominance, that we associate with American cars. And that sort of... And it asks you to root for the good guys who are essentially doing the bidding for bad guys. The good guys being Bale and Damon's characters, obviously, against the Ford Motor Company, the big bad corporation. You don't need to be a car person to appreciate the drama and intensity of this film. Ford vs. Ferrari, it's built on the drama that comes from Shelby and Miles. They're both individualists, they're both mavericks, they're both racers, essentially. But one has a little more sort of aggression than the other, let's say. They've been tasked by Ford to create not just a car, but a car that beats the best car in this race, the Ferraris. And they have a blank check, carte blanche, as Matt Damon calls it in the movie. But, always on their heels is the second in command, Leo Beebe, played by Josh Lucas. He seems to be typecasted for this role, but he just strikes you as that kind of guy, like the buttoned up, really cocky type of person. Now, Beebe's he's not one of those typical ambitious bootlicker types, he's worse because he actually buys in to the corporate dream and the methodology because he thinks it's right, He doesn't want Ken Miles driving the car because he's a volatile, quote-unquote, beatnik. That's what he calls him in the film. He doesn't conform to the idea of being a Ford man, which is essentially where the sort of corporate and non-corporate sort of conflict comes in, because this movie at its finest, at its core, is about how one group of individualists can basically change the conception of sort of achievement that comes with, or at least comes for corporate giants, because they have these, they have these guidelines that come with them in order to keep their sales up, because they're reaching to such a wide audience. They have to keep it sort of vague and approachable for millions of people to buy their product, and Ken Miles doesn't fit that idea. He's not the typical Ford man. He's not the family man who drives a Ford because it's reliable, because it's sturdy. He's a volatile, angry person in this film. He's a maverick. He's a race car driver. Beebe gets in his way in the film, but obviously because, it's a movie, feel good, he doesn't really get away with it entirely. He does have his way, Beebe, at the end of the day, but the story is still about Ken Miles' achievements. But, the thing about a character like this is if you sort of thwart that once, he just keeps coming back. And Beebe has these persistent attempts to screw Miles, which, serves to thwart the, not thwart, it juices up the interest of the film, because you now have someone to root for. If it wasn't for this character, we wouldn't feel like we actually want to be on the side of this maverick of a man who doesn't really listen to anyone. In the beginning of the film, you are seeing this guy get into arguments constantly with everyone he meets, to the point where, you recognize that as his personality, which is essentially good writing, good characters. It's joined by a wonderful cast of supporting actors. You have Catriona Balfe as Miles' wife, who, is not always a disapproving warrior, but we'll get back to that. Noah Jupe's, who is Miles' son, idolizes his dad unconditionally. That gives us more of something to root for in this sort of primal, familial sense. Having a son that looks up to his dad so reveringly, and a spouse that doesn't necessarily worry all the time about the dangerous activities her other spouse gets up to. And there's Ray McKinnon as Shelby's most trusted engineering lieutenant, with a lot of the funniest lines in the film. The funniest for me being, at this point, the uninitiated tend to soil themselves. If you haven't seen the movie, I will wait for you to watch it and point that out, because it's top class. Anyway, Matt Damon is superb in this kind of role because, he excels at it. It's that typical integrity, man with integrity who, goes off the path a little bit and then has to come back and right himself. Ford versus Ferrari is not as heavy as that is, obviously. It's a lot more fun, and the dialogue is full of zingers. The film is just beautifully shot. There's a scene where Christian Bale delivers a sort of philosophy based on racing to his son after, trying out a car in the middle of the film, and it's shot against this like dying sun on the horizon, just past sunset. It's beautiful. It's just beautiful to watch. But there's very little in this film that looks tricked up or obviously animated, but the problem is that this film 30 years ago would have been perfect for a studio. But now when we actually have the technology to make these films seem more real than they are, it's considered a risk for some reason. I mean, mostly because, again, corporate influences. We have movies like Marvel, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, reliance on old existing intellectual property, all that kind of stuff. But Ford versus Ferrari delivers a really balanced and wholesome cinematic meal for the most part. Until you realize that you can view this movie through another lens.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
That lens reveals the hollowness of it. If you look at it as if Ford versus Ferrari is the story of an independent filmmaker who is brought in by a studio to make a big budget franchise, you can take that as Shelby's story, because he comes in with this amiable sort of suave manner that has to balance between his own understanding of the art and corporate interests. After his first project fails, he's summoned to the Ford offices in Michigan for a very high-stakes meeting with Ford, Henry Ford II. And what Shelby says during that meeting is technically sort of holding up a mirror to the making of these studio films, including Ford versus Ferrari, because that is a studio film. He explains that the biggest obstacle to victory is the bureaucratic structure of, corporations, because you can't win a race by committee, same way you can't make a film by committee, unless that committee is obviously the film crew. You can't make a film by a sort of business committee, He asserts that everything that Ford accomplished at that first Le Mans is actually a success because Enzo Ferrari saw the quality of their car. And he says that he's scared to death that you're going to start trusting me. You're welcome. And that is the sort of turning point in the film, because now this independent filmmaker gets his liberty to do what he's good at. When you see the film, you realize that there's two really major sort of highlights, and they're both viewable in the trailer. There's Shelby showing Henry II. I called him Hank. Henry Ford II, the power of his race car to really help him understand, the stakes of actually driving. And when Shelby and Miles fight like brothers, it's very funny because at that point, Shelby picks up a can to hit Miles with, but you see him visually drop the can and pick up a loaf of bread, which is ostensibly softer. I mean, I'd rather get hit by a loaf of bread than a can of beans. But it just shows you that despite the current conflict, there is, sort of love behind all of it. As I said, Buff's the only female character with more than a line or two. And she swings sort of between cool wife who loves to see her husband race and just an uninteresting, soppy wife who constantly worries about her husband's mortality. It's hard to avoid in a film that's focused on this type of world, one that's completely inhabited by men, especially when the center of the film is the relationship between Miles and Shelby. As I said, Shelby is this people pleaser, but Miles hates everyone. He's a misanthrope. When it comes to my point, what didn't work for this movie is that sort of corporate brushing up of the authentic truth. In reality and in the movie, Ford swept the podium at Le Mans, obviously, right? But not because Ken Miles and the car outraced Ferrari, but because all of those cars broke down and Ford excelled. The true drama in this race is not the fact that who can go faster. That's just what makes it look cool in a movie theater. But in the engineering, something that this film pays very little attention to, except for, just displaying that these characters are adept at it. The thing that makes the 24 Hours of Le Mans so incredible is that endurance aspect. It stretches, the race goes back to the earliest days of auto racing, when keeping a car running was just as important, if not more, than just being able to make it fast. Ferrari's cars in that weren't just cool and quick. They were incredible feats of engineering. As well as, the making of the GT40. It was a years-long effort that started with work by engineers from Britain, and, it involved things like dynamometers to abuse engines until they blew, finding fixes, doing it again. There's a man named Mose Nowland who went between Detroit, North Carolina, and California, sort of fixing the leaks on the cars with the trout fishing line. These stories, they're all of these incredible amounts of people that tinkered and innovated and made what the GT40 eventually becomes. And these are such interesting stories. But, again, for a corporate group, putting Christian Bale and Matt Damon against a bunch of men in suits, bad men in suits, it's just an easier formula than squeezing drama out of a dynamometer. I don't even know what that is. Just looked it up. But that's the thing. In tailoring the story for consumption without any trouble, it stumbles with omissions. And these omissions could eventually make this art what it was. Provocative, what art is supposed to be. You can talk about Ken's domestic life. There's a sort of balance there between, the good parts and the bad parts. You see both. But there's no mention of Shelby's past or actual life whatsoever. He's seen briefly in the beginning, living alone in this messy trailer, but I don't even know if that's his home. No one knows no one knows where he lives. There's no sort of family life. There's no romantic relationships. The only friends that he has are essential to the plot of the film. It's a sleight of hand. It sort of obscures the complexity of life that these films are supposed to show. And it shows that there is a complete unwillingness to contend with some of the facts and occurrences of this time and these people that didn't fit into that sort of ideal movie blockbuster bubble. The real Carroll Shelby was married 7 times, and 2 or 3 of those marriages overlapped with that 8-year span covered in the movie. And there's a lot of talk of extramarital affairs as well. For a guy that got married 7 times, I feel like that could have invited some more drama into this film, but it's just scantily mentioned whatsoever. You don't really hear much about it. Here, if the studio allowed them to talk about this, obviously I'm not saying you have to talk about all of this because, see, this is a sidetrack. Now, you can't talk about every single aspect of a character's life in a movie because that's just not how movies work. If they did, we'd be watching movies for hours and hours and hours. But even a mention of this, it would have, I guess, been to offer a hero that has certain characteristics that contrast the sanitized image of Hollywood heroes in family-friendly movies that, are delivered to our, screens now, I guess, every week, because that's all we see. We see these corporate-controlled and sort of clean, tight-knit Ford man types of heroes in so many of these movies, and that's just what we've been seeing for so long. But the world is hungry for real, authentic storytelling. And how can you write a movie or even make a movie about, with a message of sort of this and going out of the corporate regulations and doing your own thing when that's the type of character that you've made your protagonist? Doesn't make sense to me. That's where the hollowness comes in. But this is also seen in the racing in the film. There's plenty of footage on the Le Mans track in this film and others, Daytona. I don't think they go to Sebring, but there's also the local race in the beginning. They're all characterized by the tricks of cinematography and, special effects. But most of them are combined with just very simple, basic emotions. The scenes of speed feature very fast montages of narrow arrays of imagery. There's brief sort of moments where you can see the track from the front of the car, what the road looks like from the bumper, side views of cars sort of moving around, maneuvering around for positions and overtaking others. There's overhead views of the cars around the tracks. There's views of the driver seen upwards, or even close-ups, and specifically in Ken's case, when he starts to talk to himself while driving. Side note, I could imagine myself doing that. I definitely could. I don't drive yet because I don't have a driving license, but I know if and I don't want to say if and when because I probably won't, but if I do start driving, I can definitely imagine speaking to myself like Ken does, the sort of personification of the car type of way. Even though I'm not a big car person, this movie and also the Formula One docuseries on Netflix, Drive to Survive, have really pushed me back into this world. Quite interesting. But I digress. Anyway, the result of these sort of spectacular details, and all the mentions of all the different ways of narrowing down what a race feels like, they convey a bunch of really high-speed activity that signifies racing. It talks about speed, and it brings in the drama of the movie into it, but it doesn't talk about the essential experience of a race, What is the point of seeing a driver through a windshield looking at the road ahead and the other drivers? What is it that makes the uninitiated soil themselves, but can give people like Ken and Shelby the biggest rush of their lives? We don't get that sense. We don't get the sense of what it feels like to be driving around for 24 hours or even 8 hours, in terms of the shifts. In an interview, Christian Bale talks about whether or not he actually drove the cars. And he said he did, but for most of the long stretches, he said that he'd get bored, just driving around, pretending to be excited the whole way through. And I feel like that is what we were missing. You know, not only is spending 8 hours in the same seat, navigating the same course over and over again alluded to in the film, you know, when he talks to his son about what the map for Le Mans looks like, but it's never seen. We never get into the driver's shoes because we're never allowed to. We always see it from the outside, except for in Shelby's flashbacks. But even then, that's a dark mess. At the end of the day, that's what makes this sort of movie, I guess, not really work for me. Because while it deals with matters of life and death, of, you know, fame, industry, personal vision, it eventually just ends up infantilizing them. Because the corporate culture that it reflects, it also embodies. It doesn't go beyond the structure that it emerged from. Now, whose fault that might be, I'm not sure. But could you imagine a Ford versus Ferrari movie if it was made by an independent filmmaker with, well, maybe if it was made by Netflix, that would make sense because Netflix gives you creative freedom and as much money as you want, right? That seems to be the deal. But I'd like to see that. I'd like to see another movie that encapsulates this sort of adrenaline and sort of passion that comes for racing, because it truly is a rush, from what I hear in my binging of the Formula One series. At the end of the day, I wish this movie was more real. I wish it hadn't left out certain things. But I really enjoyed the driving.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Alright, welcome back. I want to take this next bit to talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because I feel like that's one, you have to kind of talk about the MCU when you're doing a movie podcast. Like, that's pretty much the biggest cinematic innovation of our time. But also, as like a genuine fan of the entire thing, Kevin Feige is one of my, like, cinematic idols. I know it's weird to say, but the way he sort of merged film and business and how corporate interests and artistic integrity sort of match in the MCU is something that I'm fascinated by. One of the greatest examples for me, and till date my favorite MCU film, is Taika Waititi's Thor 3, Thor Ragnarok. Now, that is an incredible film. Not just stylistically, but also with the way he sort of transforms Thor's character completely, how he brings to light this completely new side of Chris Hemsworth that we see in the movies to come. He almost sets the tone, the comedic tone in that film for the rest of the Marvel movies. Infinity War and Endgame are infinitely funnier. In part also because of, the Russo brothers. But I think because of Thor 3 and how that changed the characters. But, I digress. I want to talk about the MCU because I love it, essentially, which is what the point I was making was. As a kid growing up, Iron Man was one of the first sort of movies I watched that got me back into movies. I remember watching Iron Man, then Thor, then, Iron Man 2, I guess. I skipped the first Captain America till way later in my life. But at this point, it wasn't a cinematic universe. I had no idea what a movie studio was back then. I think when Iron Man 1 released, I was like 8 years old. But as I grew older, as the first Avengers, I have seen that film countless times because it's on every single flight. And unfortunately, because of Singapore, Singapore is an island nation, you can't really go anywhere. I had to fly out. So I've been on a bunch of flights, and every single flight seemed to have this movie after 2012, and it was just insane. I've probably seen that film maybe 30 times, counting flights, TV runs, just on my computer during my rewatches. I've seen the entire MCU in order once. That was after Endgame came out, I think a year after Endgame came out. But I've seen each individual movie at least twice. And that's just for movies like Thor 2, because no one wants to watch Thor 2 more than twice. But that's sort of the point I want to make. Because MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as great as it is, as sort of defining as it is of an era of filmmaking, of the ramifications it has on business, one of the biggest things that the MCU has caused is the sort of move towards OTT platforms like Netflix and Amazon and Hulu for not only more creative freedom, but also the budget to pursue sort of original, liberating, creative ideas, because now we've come to a point where every single blockbuster movie is either like the 7th installment of a franchise or just a remake of some old movie. There has to be some existing intellectual property that they have to base it on to justify the costs that go into making these movies now, because prices are just going up and up. And a lot of that is because of these Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, these superhero movies that have come to define our generation of filmmaking. To put it in like a sports sense, the MCU is like, the Yankees, or like, I don't know, what's a team in the NBA that everyone goes to, like the Lakers. You start off in the league, young, and this is like if you're involved in movies in any way, really. You prove yourself at a smaller station, be it whether you started as a sophomore, undrafted sophomore in like the Denver Nuggets, and then eventually, get traded to the Lakers because you become a big superstar at the Nuggets. That's what happens to these film people, be it a writer, even a grip or a sound person. You start small in the indie sort of league and then graduate into the big leagues, which is studio filmmaking. And what do you do? Because now all these studios are making the same CGI superhero movies. But, saying all this makes me sound like Martin Scorsese, when he said that these movies are nothing but roller coaster rides. And he's right, they are. What do we go to roller coasters for? For the feeling of thrill and excitement and adrenaline. But what do we eventually end up going to these Marvel movies for as well? That same thrill and excitement, the adrenaline. And that's one of the things I have to complain about. Which got me thinking, I love these movies, but there's also limitations to all of them. And I want to spend the next few episodes, let's say, going through the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because I love these movies. They're a big part of why I want to do film. But every good movie has its flaws. Movies are a representation of life, and life isn't really perfect. So today I'm going to start with what I think are the limitations of the MCU as a series, rather than just the films. In terms of the cohesive nature of the storytelling, in terms of the visual language of the films, there's a lot to praise. And I went on about Thor Ragnarok before this. There's a lot that we can learn from. But there's some mistakes. They did make Iron Man 3. Iron Man 2 even. That was terrible. Just a complete underuse of Sam Rockwell. Complete underuse of Sam Rockwell. But you have to understand the limitations of this series. Because you have to come to think of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a TV series, but does it even work as a full series? The main focus of these films is to create a serialized universe cinematically that translates the serialized storytelling format of comic books. Where characters have their own stories, but some of their journeys are interactive, let's say. They cross over here and there, we see them here and there, and each character gets their own development. But to understand this, we also have to understand comic book storytelling as a form. So let's say at any given time, Marvel is publishing multiple comic series focusing on all the characters we've come to love and adore. The series, they publish a new episode, a new issue every month, and have been for decades and probably will be for decades. These stories have carried on since then, because about every year or so, among all of these series, there'll be a big crossover episode similar to like the Avengers movies. And in this crossover episode, everything about the universe sort of changes as a consequence of the actions needed to be taken. It changes up the entire status quo. And then that next year, we'll follow the new status quo and how the characters sort of deal with that. It's the same thing over and over again. For example, after the Civil War series, Captain America, it follows the fallout of Captain America's assassination, where Bucky becomes the sort of central character and takes over the mantle eventually. Spoiler alert, sorry. Tony Stark becomes the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., I know, impossible to imagine, and sets up a government-mandated version of the Avengers, like the movies. This carries on for 2 years until the next series, which was Secret Invasion. Here, Norman Osborn, the Spider-Man villain, he takes over S.H.I.E.L.D. after he saves Earth from a Skrull invasion, and sets up like a suicide squad of Avengers, Avengers made up pretty much of villains. And for the next year, we follow as Osborn sort of imposes his will on the the comic book universe. And, you have Iron Man's story solo series. Follows him on the run to prevent Norman Osborn from extracting information from his brain. We love comic books. And sure, at the end of it, Steve Rogers comes back from the dead and takes back his role as Captain America. Sorry, Bucky. And Norman Osborn is taken down, but these sort of changes stuck around for long enough for us to watch these characters deal with them. We spend time understanding the fallouts of these events and deal with the consequences in real time as audiences. But the MCU doesn't work that way. It releases 3 movies a year. You can't fit in these intricate, complex, developing stories. This is not a series of scams. These are hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. And that's what I was talking about earlier with the divide of corporate interests and artistic integrity. I love the balance that the MCU has, like I said, but at a certain point, there are limitations. Most of them have to do with money, but that's just the system that we see this art developing.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Anyway, but because of this, after Phase 1, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, for example, we have a change in the status quo, obviously, because S.H.I.E.L.D. collapses, Hydra returns, and then there's Age of Ultron after that, where there's a new Avengers lineup at the end. At the end of Civil War, that new lineup splits up, and the movies, they're like the equivalent of a large crossover event in the comics. But what we don't see is the years of stories in between those movies. Without these smaller events, we don't feel the change, and we're desensitized to these shifts, the paradigm shifts that come with every big MCU movie. Let's take, for example, Winter Soldier and Age of Ultron. So S.H.I.E.L.D. shutting down has no effect on any of the movies. At the end of Winter Soldier, S.H.I.E.L.D's ships all blow up, right? But the next movie, Age of Ultron, Nick Fury just shows up on one of those ships. Hydra is shown to be this huge threat that takes over S.H.I.E.L.D., but all of their scatters after they get blown up for the first time in the Winter Soldier get dealt with neatly as the opening scene of Age of Ultron. The new Avengers lineup at the end of Age of Ultron as well, they only get one fight or mission, whatever, together, scene at the start of Civil War. After that, the next crossover moment is Infinity War, which is the greatest crossover in cinematic history. But we never see or hear about the developments between Civil War and Infinity War. Captain America is just he's a supporting character in Infinity War. It's not his story, it's Iron Man's story. But he shows up, he has a beard, he says hi to friends, that's about it. But that's where the effect of this lack of development sort of is felt most. It's within characters like this. In the comics you can read any solo series and get a completely solid story about the character. In the MCU, you don't get movies after the third. Very rarely. Thor, I think, is the only one to have more than a third movie. And that's not even made yet. So, to follow Tony Stark after Iron Man 3, you have to watch all the movies he makes appearances in, where he's just a side character. In Civil War, or the Spider-Man movies, where he's just used as a plot development tool. Since he's no longer the main character, events about his life happen off screen. He and Pepper Potts break up, get back together, get engaged, and have a kid between movies. We don't ever see any of that. They have a kid literally in between one movie, in the middle of it, in the beginning of it. But we still don't see it. It's still off screen, so it counts. But in order to support the corporate structure that these movies are built on, in order to keep raking in the billions, these movies have no choice but to skip these parts. You know? These movies can only be so long. They're already like 2 hours long. No superhero movie is supposed to be that long. They're supposed to be a crisp 90 minutes. Well, what can you do? You know, the best example of a story missed out is Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier. Or, you know, as we knew him for like 5 minutes at the end of Black Panther, White Wolf. Why didn't that ever come up again? I was looking forward to calling him White Wolf. I think he's credited as Bucky Barnes, not even White Wolf. Anyway, look at the story. Look at the way his story was told in the comics. You know, specifically this Brubaker series from the early 2000s when, you know, his character was first introduced. Like the movie, Bucky and Cap, they have these run-ins, but eventually figure out who each other is. You know, that they grew up together. But that's where it strays from its original source material, Winter Soldier. You know, in the comics, Bucky remembers everything because he puts his hand on the Tesseract, the cosmic cube. And then he starts to feel all this tremendous guilt over his actions, and we see all of this. We see him help Cap stop terrorist attacks, and then eventually move on to even asking Nick Fury for a job at S.H.I.E.L.D., you know. And eventually, Cap is assassinated, and Bucky takes up the mantle. But the important thing here is that these comic books devoted so much to his development that we actually care about him before he sort of picks up the shield and the mantle of Captain America. Bucky in the movies, he's in like Cap 1 for 20 minutes and then he dies. And then he shows up to Winter Soldier where we don't learn about his identity until like an hour and a half in. And in the climax we see a bit of old Bucky, like we see a glimmer of, like just a faint little bit of him. And then the movie ends. And then 2 years later we go back to Bucky in the Civil War and suddenly he's living in Bucharest being framed for a terrorist attack. The movie is entirely about Bucky. You know, whether it's to protect him, attack him, or find him, every character's motivations has something to do with him. But the only reason we have to care about him is because Captain America cares about him. He doesn't make any of his own choices. He's just he's being like thrown around and like bossed around and told what to do. Everyone makes his choices for him. And that's one of the limitations of the cinematic universe. There's a strain on telling these entire huge stories in 2-hour installments with more than 50 characters. There's only so much money in the world. In the movies, we don't see Bucky changing his entire life. We get glimpses of it. In the comics, we're made to really care about him. He's the rightful heir, but in the movies, he's just a human MacGuffin. And now I want to be clear again about my love for Marvel movies, because they've achieved so much more for a series than so many other series of films, or even sort of film trends. But the system of telling these stories has its drawbacks. What it's sort of essentially doing is trying to translate the complexities of a far more efficient medium into a less efficient one for consumption on a mass scale. Like, you can knock out 50 comics a month, but you can't knock out 50 movies a month. I mean, you can, but then they'd all look like Spy Kids. Another thing you have to consider is, I'm not sure how I feel about the Russo brothers as movies. So, okay, after Age of Ultron, the second Avengers movie, Joss Whedon, who was originally the guy who brought it all together, he became tired and left the MCU. I think there was some sort of dispute. But then the job of combining everyone the way Whedon used to do was laid onto the shoulders of Joe and Anthony Russo, the directors of Community and Arrested Development. But how did the Russos do it? You know, they were known for their upgrade in action, especially for Captain America. They added a character to his action because they pit him against normal humans rather than superhumans. You know, it was an exciting way to show Captain America's unique sort of way of standing out, his unique mannerisms in a fight or an action sequence, really. And that method is played on to the next few films. You know, there's a more characteristic outcome to the way these characters resolve conflicts. You know, Winter Soldier and Civil War, their Captain America movies, they're supposed to ground the MCU into more realistic and gritty themes of geopolitics and espionage and human drama. But they felt less like superhero movies and like more like 70s, like wannabe thriller films. They talk about big issues like freedom versus security or the accountability of vigilante justice, but these themes aren't explored dramatically. They're not dramatized. You know, Cap doesn't have to grapple with being part of this huge invasive security system because, voila, S.H.I.E.L.D. was being run by Hydra and it's the bad guys, and you don't have to take responsibility because you were tricked into doing it. Or in Civil War, Cap and Tony discuss their views on government oversight for a second, but eventually their civil war is only about how each other feels about Bucky. The films, they put on a front of dealing with heavier issues, but it's not Watchmen. They're not questioning, you know, the accountability of superheroes and all that kind of stuff. It just puts on that front. You know, it shows us the destructiveness of these big superhero fights. And eventually, it wants us to place ourselves against the damage they can cause. But then it makes these huge, damaging superhero fights its greatest marketing tool and puts it in every trailer to get people's excitement up. And then visually, the Russos, they're also the blandest of all the directors. You know, in a group of filmmakers like Taika Waititi, James Gunn, Scott Derrickson, Ryan Coogler, Jon Favreau, the Russo brothers, they're just tricking us into thinking that they're making dark and gritty films by making the production design seem dark and gritty. Like, the film's set in entirely boring locations. The grey conference rooms, grey cafeterias, underground bunkers. Even the big battles are just in, like, perfect daylight and in airport. In the Berlin airport, I'm pretty sure. In the Berlin airport, I have a feeling that you have to like fly into a different German city and then domestically arrive in Berlin because the airport isn't big enough. But I'm not sure if that's true. But that's how boring it was. Berlin airport. Joss Whedon knew what he was doing. You know, he made his scenes look like dynamic pages from comic books, like the fights in the two Avengers. You know, there's this one tracking shot that follows every single Avenger, and it like brings them into one frame in both the films at the climax. You know, in Age of Ultron, it's when they're all sort of knocking away the robots and protecting the well. I don't remember for what. But in Avengers, it's like that tracking shot as they're all on the flyover that's been broken down in front of, I think, Grand Central. Anyway, those images look like they're memorable. You know, you actually feel like I can remember those perfectly. But that's Joss Whedon. You know, he has his specific idiosyncratic tendencies that result in his exploration of the same sort of thematic interests, and you know, he has his voice plastered onto all of his films. The Russo films, they're tidy. You know, they're clean. But it feels very bland. And that right there, that's what happens when you make a movie by committee. You know, Taika Waititi spoke about this in an interview about Thor Ragnarok, I think on the Good One podcast. And he was talking about how they came up with the jokes, and so much of that film is improvised. You know, it has a much looser feel to it. And obviously, the films after that have started taking over that a lot more. But Taika Waititi said something about the jokes that are written in the Marvel scripts, and he says that they feel like they were written in a room about a year ago and placed away so that they can be used in the future. They feel outdated, they feel old, they feel tedious. And eventually that's the sort of joke that became the bread and butter of these Marvel films. You know, the Russo brothers, they tend to avoid risk in their work. At least in Infinity War. You know, they capture some really intense and violent and dark moments that could be intense and dark and violent. But they capture it in such flat and boring manners. You know, they have snap zooms on falling figures, huge, like really fast cutting during fight scenes. Pretty much any action trope you could find in the book. Something that's been done so many times, you can instantly associate it with something else. They don't use cameras in a poetic manner. I mean, they do. There are moments where they do it, but it's so refreshing when they do it because they don't do it often enough. You know, moments that come to mind are the moment where Thanos visits baby Gamora in that post-snap heaven thing, the Soul Stone or whatever he enters into, that orange world with a monastery. That is a beautiful moment captured against a stark background. Just shows the gravity of the act that he's just committed. You can see it in the image. It's memorable. But essentially, for all the shocking things that happen in a film like Infinity War, there's no memorable images of it. Except for maybe Tony Stark holding Peter Parker as he dies. Or ashes, not dies. The film, it's this grand magnum opus. It's an intergalactic magnum opus. But it's shot like the fourth installment of the Johnny English series. You know, the Russo brothers are incredible. They've done some of my favorite work on Community. There's a bottle episode that they did that I can watch any day of the week. They come from an ensemble comedy background, and they made a significant shift in the MCU's tone. Like, I have to give that to them. They've made it more fun to watch these characters interact, and their work on the movies is fine. But I want more than fine for these movies. I want these movies to be incredible. I want them to be great, brilliant, fantastic. I feel like something is holding the Russo brothers back from being their true wacky selves. And that something is the billions of dollars that go into making these movies. When you make a big risk, you can't lose it. And that's the greatest limitation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe for me. Anyway, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This is Shubh Nanda, and take care.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.